Shadowrun Returns is an isometric RPG set in the storied fantasy/cyberpunk universe of Shadowrun. The franchise, much in the same vein as Dungeons & Dragons, started life as a tabletop role-playing game. Therefore, it only makes logical sense that the brand would eventually follow in D&D's footsteps and spawn a series of quality and mechanically deep RPGs that really capture the essence of their source material. This is exactly what developer Harebrained Schemes set out to do when they launched their crowdfunding effort for Shadowrun Returns in April of 2012. During the funding stages, the title overshot its initial funding goal of just $400,000 to eventually raise more than $1.8 million for development. However, despite raising significantly more money than expected, I'm disappointed to say that after having finished the game, I'm left with the feeling that this title could have been so much more. This is because, although there's a lot that it does well, there are many issues with the game which ultimately led to a highly disappointing experience. While it is by no means bad, unfortunately, I cannot in good conscience claim Shadowrun Returns to be anything more than mediocre. The most accurate way for me to describe the overall experience is simply raw. You can tell there's a lot of potential here, and with some refinement of the formula as well as some slight tweaks to combat and gameplay, this series could be quite excellent indeed. But as much as I want to love this game, I couldn't shake the feeling that this one needed a little bit more time to cook before release. The most valuable asset that Shadowrun Returns has is its setting and source material. For those of you who might be unfamiliar with the Shadowrun franchise, Shadowrun blends aspects of Tolkien-esque fantasy with the cyberpunk-style dystopia set in the future. This creates a very unique world where magic and advanced technology coexist harmoniously. It is not just possible, but common to see any of the traditional fantasy races, such as elves, dwarves, orcs, or trolls, walking around with cybernetic limbs and wielding magic all at the same time. In addition, there's a distinctly noir atmosphere that is a result of a society which is extremely greedy and morally bankrupt. The world is all but controlled by 10 megacorporations that have been granted extraterritorial rights and rival the power of governments using the command of their own private armies. In addition, crime syndicates, religious cults, and other less than stable organizations are extremely prevalent within this twisted society. The title of the setting is derived from dangerous mercenaries known as Shadowrunners, who are contracted to achieve goals that other organizations and corporations would be unable to do without getting their hands dirty. The lore is extremely rich, and Shadowrun Returns uses that to its advantage to tell a story that could only really be made possible in this specific setting. During the game, you play as one of these mercenary Shadowrunners, who is recently down in his luck and having difficulty finding contract work. This is until an old runner friend of yours by the name of Matt Watts calls you up while you're sitting around in your apartment. You pick up the phone, and over the course of a monologue, he informs you that he is in fact deceased and has most likely been murdered. As his only true friend, he offers to reward you with a large sum of money in the form of an insurance payout, assuming you can find his killer. From here, you set off to Seattle to avenge his death and collect your reward. In your quest to find your friend's killer, you become involved in a variety of crazy side quests, such as resurrecting the dead spirits of children, infiltrating a cult-like religion, robbing a powerful corporation of valuable research, and killing interdimensional space bugs, to name a few. The game expertly recreates the atmosphere of its setting. For one, the art style does an outstanding job in capturing that gritty look that the RPG series is known for. Everything from city streets to corporate mansions feels distinctly Shadowrun, and the artists working at Harebrained Schemes seem to really show a passion in delicately and painstakingly making the pen and paper world come to life. This is easily the best part of the game's presentation, and if everything else in the game was as good as its art direction, the game would be outstanding. Nothing felt out of place, and while there were some lower res textures, everything ranged from great to at least passable. The sound design, however, cannot be regarded as passable. Where the art style serves to really immerse you in the experience, the sound design actively pulls you out of it due to its cheap, flat weapon noises, repetitive music, and overall lack of polish. The weapons are by far the worst part of the sound, as guns feel extremely weak. Also, all the weapons within specific categories, such as assault rifles, shotguns, etc., sound indistinguishable from each other. I don't know if they have exactly the same sound effect, but even if they don't, they might as well, because they sound so damn similar. This is highly unfortunate, because tactical turn-based combat systems often lack that punch that other genres such as FPS games have. Other titles of this sort have mitigated this issue by using polished and impactful sound effects that put weight behind every single attack. It is due to this issue that Shadowrun fails to engross the player in its combat. The worst example of this is when the player is given a weapon that is designed to spray out some sort of toxin to kill the aforementioned bugs. However, someone decided it was a good idea to give this gun the same sound effect as a shotgun, probably due to lack of budget. Also, for some reason unbeknownst to me, all matching in this world sounds like an airplane taking flight. I don't know why, but I assume it also has something to do with budget. If this is really the best that the developer can do and they more than quadrupled their initial Kickstarter goal, I fear to think what the quality of the sound effects would be if they had only met their expected funding. I'm inclined to believe that the game wouldn't have sound effects at all if this were in fact the case. The music in the game, while not nearly as bad as the sound effects, is somewhat simplistic. It gets the job done, but there wasn't really much experimentation with the soundtrack. The light techno theme feels aligned with the Shadowrun setting that the game takes place in, but there isn't really much song variety. And most of the songs don't have many layers to make them pop, which leaves them feeling rather shallow when compared to other, and frankly better, soundtracks. By the end of the game, I was almost sick of the main playlist of songs, which repeat very often. Luckily, the game uses a different track for the final boss, so that was appreciated, even though it does suffer from many of the same issues that other songs in the game do. But overall, it's a shame to say that you could find an equally good musical experience by simply typing cyberpunk music into YouTube or Google. I'd say that the music is alright, and it definitely gets the job done. I was just a little bit disappointed because it could have been better. Finally, the game has a complete absence of voice acting, which is not necessarily something the game requires because the dialogue already stands on its own due to how well written it is. But voice acting would have gone a long way in terms of immersing the player in the setting, and frankly it's just a shame it's not there because the writing of the dialogue is so good, and having a quality voice actor reading off those lines would have really made the unique story come to life. This brings me on to the RPG elements of the title, which initially seemed like a saving grace for the game. I cannot stress how much I love the writing, and natural feeling back and forth conversations between NPCs happen often. I actually grew to like some of the characters on a personal level throughout my playthrough, which is more than I can say for most games of its type. The game even goes so far as to have characters use the correct, lore-specific curse words and one-liners. It feels a little cringy at first, but comes off as endearing later on. Upon starting a new game, you're greeted with a character creation screen that, among other things, allows you to choose your race. I was pleased to find out that your race actually affects the way that some citizens treat you in conversation. Even if it doesn't alter the experience all that much, this lends to the game's already great sense of setting. After the first couple of hours, I was impressed with the amount of choices that you have in the dialogue tree. I felt that I had enough options when conversing with NPCs to allow me to roleplay my character's personality. After playing further, I realized that although there is often upwards of 3 dialogue options which have different attitudes to them, they rarely, if ever, affected gameplay. The game is very much on rails, and you almost never have choices in how to carry out even the most small and menial of tasks. The best example of this is when you are required to get into an airfield to investigate a murder. However, due to the fact that you are not an official Lone Star agent, which is this world's equivalent of police, the soldier guarding the gate won't let you in. I attempted to find multiple different ways to get over the fence, however the only way to do so is to talk to the 2 characters that you can interact with outside the gate. One of them will loan you a ladder for a small price, or with a charisma check will allow you to borrow the ladder for free. The other one is well, let's just call her Lady of the Night, who you must pay to distract the guard. You then use the ladder to scale the fence while the guard is being distracted. This is interesting, but I feel like there should have been a lot of other ways to accomplish your goal. After thinking a bit, I found this lack of options to be almost criminal, because it only took me about 2 minutes to come up with some other solutions to the task. You could A, simply shoot the guard, which is an option available in most other RPGs of this type. B, spike a beverage and give it to him as a gift. This is not as far-fetched as it might seem, because you do a similar thing with the Lone Star agent earlier in the story. Or C, find someone who can forge a pass to fool the guard. This lack of options also applies to the main quest, which you have almost no input on in the overall scheme of things. This agitated me, because in a setting where so much is possible, the game decides to limit you to only one outcome. It doesn't allow you to truly roleplay your character all that much. This is a damn shame, especially since the title is an adaptation of a tabletop RPG where the player has a virtually infinite number of options to accomplish every task, assuming you have a decent game master. And yes, for those of you wondering why I keep on referencing tabletop games, it's because I play them, D&D in particular. As far as gameplay mechanics go, the game adheres pretty lightly to its roots in the pen and paper RPG. Though much of the systems have been streamlined, it still retains its original character. Many of the attributes have been replaced in favor of fewer but more all-encompassing ones. And this is probably a good thing, because much like many other traditional RPGs of its type, there are whole sections of a rulebook that are dedicated to the intricacies of character creation in the original tabletop Shadowrun, and I doubt that many people would be willing to read that much. Although, you never know, because once again, this game has no voice acting, which means a metric shit ton of text, so for those of you with dyslexia, or if you just don't like reading, you might as well write this title off now. As you progress through the game, you are given points known as karma, which you can use to level up certain aspects of your character. These points are given to you for performing specific preset tasks. This system is pretty good for the most part, but my one major issue with it is that many of the skills that you can put points into are rather useless when compared to others. For example, I decided to put a considerable amount of points into the charisma tree, which allows you to access unique dialogue options with specific types of characters, such as Shadowrunners, guards, or members of corporate society. This is good in principle, but I was sorely disappointed with how many times you were given the opportunity to use each of these options. Many of them were used only twice or maybe even 3 times if you're lucky throughout the entire 10 to 12 hour campaign, which left me feeling that I could have allocated these carbon points into something else that would have given me much more value. Also, there's a somewhat disappointing amount of gear variety in the game, not because there aren't enough weapons, but because they all feel exactly the same. They might have more damage, larger magazines, or distance, but they all feel rather similar, with no magical effects or anything applied to any of them. This is highly disappointing, especially since cyberpunk games have the potential for really cool and interesting guns. Add that with the ability to use magic-infused weapons that this setting has, and this game has no excuse for these run-of-the-mill basic firearms that it uses. Moving on to the issue of currency, or new yen as it is referred to in Shadowrun. I managed to get through the entire game while purchasing the most high-end weapons available to me at the time, without ever having to make meaningful decisions, or not buy something due to lack of funds. This is probably because I did every side quest available to me, which gave me a lot of excess money to use. But even if you don't do side quests, you will have plenty of currency to purchase most of the upgrades you will want. I was also rather disappointed to see that you couldn't loot 90% of the dead bodies that I stacked up, which is a problem indicative of the interaction with the game as a whole. The world doesn't allow for very much interaction, which is extremely frustrating for me because the setting is begging to be interacted with. The game is based off a pen and paper RPG, a setting in which players have the liberty to do almost anything they set their minds to doing. Shadowrun Returns lacks this ability, therefore the city of Seattle seems almost devoid of life. Most of the NPCs in the world are non-interactable, which means no dialogue, no nothing. They might as well be cardboard cutouts. It's unfortunate too, because even a bit of dialogue for each of these minor characters would have made the experience much more immersive. Ultimately, the world feels like a pretty painting, fun to look at, but as much as you might want to, you aren't allowed to touch. The game world itself was also quite a big letdown, because it's not open world at all, and you never had the option to go back and revisit areas again. This is in stark contrast to games like Baldur's Gate and Pillars of Eternity, which allow you to go wherever you please on a large map. I'm not saying that all games of this type need to be open world, but there needs to be something binding them together. This was extremely disappointing because the levels ended up feeling like a bunch of individual areas with little to no connection between them, aside from the fact that they were all set in Seattle. While loading into a new area, you are given a few paragraphs of text to read about each location before you enter. These attempt to give you some understanding of how you got there, but really nothing beats just walking around the game world to get to your next destination. You use the central tavern that you come across fairly early, known as the Seamstress Union, as a hub to upgrade weapons, talk to characters, and as a launch point for most of these missions. You are barred from any form of backtracking throughout the entire game, and it would have been so easy to implement. Either way, I was extremely disappointed with this, and hopefully this is altered in the more recent games in the series, because it would have impacted the feel of the game quite a lot. This makes colorful Seattle feel very flat, which is, I'll say it again, a damn shame, because I cannot convey how phenomenal the setting is. So let's take this into the home stretch and move into the combat. The combat, much like the rest of the game, is mediocre by genre standards. You have your basic cover system and turn-based combat, but other games in the genre just execute it better. Animations are okay, though they're not great, and the action point system is only as complex as it needs to be, which is nice. Enemy variety is a little lackluster, but the game is fairly short, so I didn't mind it too much. Magic doesn't have the same level of detail or impact as it could have, but it's decent enough that playing a mage-based character is probably just as gratifying for most people. There's also a cool hacking minigame, which is known as decking in the Shadowrun universe, because hacking is just too mainstream. This was novel at first, but decking was basically just a simplified version of the combat system, and I ended up finding it to be rather boring by the end of the game. Also, if you plan on doing any mission without a designated hacker, then good luck, because it is required for some of the missions, and without one, you'll be screwed. The worst thing that the game has is in its combat, which is its AI, which is at times downright silly. The game is also too easy on every setting. I never once felt the need to save scum because I didn't find myself dying very often, and the game is also just pretty fair in general. though due to the somewhat boring and repetitive nature of combat, I hated having to replay missions when I did mess up on a run. And at points, I just turned the game off for the day because I didn't want to deal with it. Before every mission, you have the option to build a crew of Shadowrunners who will assist you in your task. You can go with the budget and less skilled options, or the more expensive and better equipped squad members. I never once felt the need to utilize the expensive options though, and I got through the entire game without ever using them. This might have also contributed to my excess of cash by the end of the game. And when the game finally did come to a close, I felt extremely OP and basically just stomped my way through the final level and boss fight. Both of which were rather anticlimactic and did nothing new from the other levels with the exception of one minor mechanic. I also don't see reason to specialize in any kind of weapon besides rifles, which are just straight up better in most situations. Beyond that, the combat is pretty run-of-the-mill, much like the rest of the game. I'm sure that I missed some things in my review. For example, I didn't want to get into the whole implementation of cybernetic body parts because it would take up a lot of time to explain a fairly unimportant gameplay system. But I think most of you watching probably already have a pretty clear picture of my opinions on the game. There are some final notes I would like to insert in this part of the video, as they didn't really fall into any of the other categories for this review. A, the game was ported to mobile, and it shows by the poor UI, which was obviously made with the touchscreen in mind. And the game also has a very bare-bones settings menu, and that doesn't even include key bindings as an option. This is inexcusable because B, the game is cheaper on mobile. It currently goes for about $2 on the App Store, which is 86% off the $15 price tag that it currently has on Steam. One could attempt to justify this by its extremely poor performance on mobile systems with constant crashes on certain models, or the fact that the PC has mod support, but mod support is not really worth an extra $13 for the game. Because of this, I recommend that anyone who cares about the value of their dollar should buy this game on a recently made mobile device, or buy it off of G2A or GOG, preferably the latter. And finally, the aforementioned mod support is actually supposed to be pretty solid, and many claim it to be the main selling point of the game, but I won't be factoring this into my review as I'm only reviewing the base game. I know it seems that I'm being a little overcritical of the game, which I probably am, but I'm doing it out of love and a sense of hope for the other games in this series. I feel like a shitty teacher giving a project a C even though I know some kid worked very hard on it. I'm doing it to give feedback and to point out what the game does wrong so that they can go back and fix it later. And quite frankly, by the time I finished the game, I was rather relieved. Almost everything that I mentioned here can and should be fixed with a few subtle tweaks to game design. There's a lot of potential for this series going forward, and I do intend on playing the 2 more recent games in the series sometime soon, but I hope that they learn and improve on the groundwork that Shadowrun Returns laid. You can tell that the devs worked very hard on this game, and have a passion to provide us as gamers with a great experience. But, as much as I hate saying it, passion, although invaluable, does not make a good game. Good game design does. Thank you for watching. I'll be coming out with more RPG reviews sometime in the near future. I spent a long time working on this video, and I'm new to this, so send feedback, good and bad. Thank you.